I've been caught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been taught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been broke.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Dov Tuzman, and you're back on Equal Footing. Happy holidays, Hanukkah Sameach, Merry Early Christmas to those celebrating. Special time of year. So, we figured we'd do it justice, as we always do, by analyzing what we perceive to be reality, received wisdom, challenging it, maybe getting in trouble a little along the way, but learning. So what's a good subject? A couple days before Christmas, the celebration of the birth of the figure known as Jesus of Nazareth. Well, let's talk about the birth of the figure known as Jesus of Nazareth. The birth of Jesus is much more debated than you might think. And why is it important? The idea here is not to in any way demean Christian faithful. It's in no way to enter into a theological debate either. But instead, it's in the interest of unity. You know, it's nice when Hanukkah and Christmas fall at the same time of year. We're all in a festive spirit. And that led me to think this year around what divides us as Christians and Jews. Well, one could argue that the central dividing line in Jewish and Christian theology is the idea of the deity, Jesus Christ. The idea of the divinity, not in the sense of we're all divine, we're all sons and daughters of Hashem, we're all part of God and of God's universe. This I think we can both agree on. But rather, was this figure, Jesus Christ, divine? Was this a god? Or a demigod, or a semigod, or part of a triumvirate, or what have you? Well, in the Jewish faith, of course, we wouldn't hold that belief. We believe that even Moshe Rabbeinu, David HaMelech, our patriarchs, were all in some sense flawed. Of course, they were righteous, tzaddikim, righteous people, but we don't hold any man or woman to that standard, to be divine, to be a God on earth. That is antithetical to Jewish theology. Now, that is, of course, at the center. I shouldn't say of course. That is, I perceive to be at the center of Christian theology. And at the root of that belief, of course, is the coming into being of the Christian, I guess, patriarch, the Christian deity, if you will, Jesus Christ. So let's get into this from an academic and religious scholarly perspective with two extraordinary guests, one who's been on the program before, love that we have him back, another who's first time here in the program. This is Harvard night. They both studied at Harvard. I did too, guys, but much less decorated degrees as you have. All right, let's start by introducing Professor David Weddle, reintroducing Professor David Weddle. He's a professor emeritus of religion at Colorado College. He's taught courses in his career in comparative theology and ethics, American religions, and the philosophy of religion. Professor Weddle served as chair of the department at Colorado College. He was active on many committees. He was chosen as a senior scholar by the Rocky Mountain Great Plains region of the American Academy of Religion. He was named ultimately the David and Lucille Packard Chair. He previously taught at Cornell College in Iowa. He chaired the Department of Religion there for 20 years. Professor Weddle is a lifetime honorary member of the American Academy of Religion. He's the author of many wonderful books. I think, read most of Professor Weddle's books and articles, and I love them. One is called Miracles, Wonder and Meaning in World Religions. Another called Sacrifice in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We've talked about that before in the program. And many other scholarly articles and book reviews, including a wonderful polemic from 1992 on this subject of the birth of Jesus. Professor Weddle's current essays examine the role of religion in American politics. Could never be more important. Professor Weddle lives with his wife Sharon of 60 years in Woodland Park, Colorado. Professor Weddle, welcome back to Equal Footing.
Thank you very much, John. Glad to be here.
I'm intimidated tonight because both of our guests have better radio voices than I do. They're both so resonant and wise. Reverend John Haugen. First time on the program. Reverend Haugen is a PhD and an ordained pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He holds a BA in sociology from Luther College, also in Iowa. You guys have that in common. A Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in religion and literature from the University of Virginia. I should have mentioned that Professor Weddle also holds his PhD from Harvard Divinity School. Reverend Dr. John Haugen, his career has included parish ministry, university chaplaincy, adjunct teaching in university settings and seminary settings, and even and ministry administration, I should say. And in these capacities, he's consistently emphasized addressing social issues, mining the arts for spiritual experiences and insights, worship, and pastoral care. So that unity that we look for on this program between kind of theological insight and academic work, and also tying it to real life. Reverend Haugen's publications include 4 books, many hymn texts, many articles. He's an enthusiastic volunteer docent at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, enjoys writing and painting and photography, etc. And Professor Haugen lives in Elkins Park, which is dear to my heart. I have a lot of family in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. And he's a parent and a grandparent. Reverend Haugen, welcome to Equal Footing.
Oh, thank you, Doug, and happy Hanukkah to you and to all of your audience.
Thank you, and Merry Christmas to you. Reverend Haugen, can you start us off, pretend you're talking to someone who doesn't know anything about what I'm supposed to know about the birth of this figure we know as Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, or I guess Jesus of Bethlehem, as it were. What should I know? What's the kind of received wisdom in the Christian faith, if there is one, about his prenatal reality and his birth?
Well, there is a story, the Christmas story, of course, but you won't find it in any one place if you go to the Christian New Testament, because there are certain scenes that are in one book and certain scenes that are in others. But if you put them all together, they come out in a kind of order that is present on medieval altarpieces and also in children's pageants that are put on by Sunday school children today. So the first scene in that story is the Annunciation. That's when the angel Gabriel, an angel who is familiar to readers of the Hebrew Scriptures, when the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and announces to her that she will be the mother of God's child. She is perplexed by that. She is unsure of what it means, but after some persuasion by Gabriel, she allows what the angel is announcing. She allows it to happen to her. Some of the theology around that is that Jesus was pre-existent, existing in heaven with God from the very beginning, before creation, and then at this moment in history was conceived by Mary as without sin, and became human, fully human as well as fully divine. That's a mystery. We can talk about that later if you wish. The next scene is the visitation. Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth, who becomes the mother of John the Baptist, and they talk to each other, and Elizabeth greets her in a way that is quoted in the Hail Mary, full of grace. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Somewhere in this early part of the pregnancy of Mary, an angel appears, sometimes attributed to Gabriel again, but that's not clear in the Scriptures as far as I know. An angel appears to Joseph and says, you're engaged to this Mary.
Now,
She's
Joseph,
pregnant,
just for the uninitiated here, so Joseph is Mary's betrothed. This is Mary's fiance or husband, kind of earthly father of Jesus.
Yeah. So he is the either father or stepfather, if you will, of Jesus. And my understanding of Hebrew marriage customs at that time in history is that the betrothal or the engagement is considered a marriage So they are considered fully married, but they don't live together yet, is what I think I remember. Anyway, they go to Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph, so that because the Romans are taking a census, and they go to their ancient ancestors' hometown of Bethlehem, where Jesus is born. The next thing that happens, the next scene, is that angels, again led by Gabriel, supposedly, the angels come to visit shepherds that are out in the fields tending their sheep, and they are directed to go and worship the newborn King, Jesus. So they go to visit. 8 days pass.
Now, is this where they're guided? And you have to excuse me for not knowing the history. This is why we wanted to give us a primer here, Reverend, on the background of Jesus' birth. Is this where there's the star of Bethlehem that's guiding people to his place of birth?
As far as I can remember, I think the shepherds were led more by directions. Go to Bethlehem. They knew where they were going, and you'll find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. It's really, the star is really more prominent in the story of the wise men, or the Magi, and they come later. In fact, they might even come a couple years later. Historians are divided on that, but the people who put on children's pageants always include it in the in the Christmas story pageant. So the wise men come as well, led by a star. They're astrologers from the east and have interpreted the stars to tell them that a king is being born in Bethlehem. The 8th day after the birth of Jesus, he is circumcised. There's a lot of attention to fulfilling Jewish law in the Christmas story, and the circumcision is one. Another one is that about a month after the birth, there's a presentation of Jesus in the temple, which is connected with Mary's purification, as she had been defiled by blood in the birth of Jesus.
So, Reverend, let's take a pause there. You've gotten us through from kind of the pre-birth to the birth to the post-birth, and there's so much we could talk about in this program. We're really going to be focused in on the prenatal and birth narrative, as opposed to what happens in childhood and later, which are found in certain, or sometimes called apocryphal gospels. I'm sure Professor Weddle could talk to us about that. But Professor Weddle, let's well, we're going to have to take our first break in a moment. But the first question I'll ask you before we go to our next break is what Reverend Haugen so crisply went through in terms of the birth narrative seems, when you hear one person tell it, to be as if it were coming from one source. But in fact, it's coming from several sources that are kind of pieced together and sometimes stand in opposition to each other. Before we go to the break, what are the actual written sources that Christians refer to when trying to get their head around Jesus in the womb and Jesus being born? Professor Weddle, can you hear us?
Sorry, I had my mute on.
Go ahead.
The only source of information about Jesus is from the Gospels. And the Gospels are not biographies. They are proclamations of Jesus' identity as the Son of God and the Messiah of Israel. So these early stories, as far as we know, belong to the oral tradition that both Matthew and Luke drew from. But they drew from quite different oral traditions. So the two infancy narratives, which are usually conflated in the traditional creche scene, where the angel and the shepherds and the astrologers are all standing around a manger adoring Jesus. This is an anachronism. As Reverend Haugen pointed out, in Matthew, the Magi show up 2 years after Jesus is born, and they enter a house. They do not meet at a manger. So what we have here are early oral traditions that are added by Matthew and Luke to the basic story of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark.
So
Mark has.
We're going to get back to that right after the break. I think it's a great place to pause, because this story, which is intricate and lays the foundation for 2,000 years of theology afterwards, is very, as it turns out, narrowly, what's the word I'm looking for? It's built on a very, very few words in only a couple of sources. I think that's fascinating, and it leads to, as we'll see, centuries of debate. You're here in Equal Footing. We're on our kind of Christmas show, if you will. We're talking about the alternative. Yeah, I said the word alternative. The alternative narratives of the birth of Jesus. We're here with Professor David Weddle, Reverend John Haugen, and we'll let you know right after the break how you can participate. Be right back. Equal Footing is brought to you in part by DocuVax. You've heard me talk about DocuVax before. In brief, it's a medical digital locker. It is very cool. You download the DocuVax app, DocuVax, on your iPhone or Android device, or you can look it up online at docuvax.com. And very easily, you can download and categorize and get organized, not by you. You don't have to do it. Medical professionals that are on 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, they do it for you. They organize your medical records, vaccine records, blood tests, anything else in your medical locker, colorectal exam results, breast cancer screenings, etc. Put it all in one place so you don't have to worry about tracking down old medical records or sharing test results with a new healthcare provider or a new insurance coverage provider. DocuVax covers over 60 different important elements of your medical profile. As I said, from vaccines to screenings, even blood type and allergy information. It's only $6.99 per month to sign up. That can save you can literally save $200 just by using DocuVax to get a reference to a specialist instead of having to go through your general practitioner. You know, as a pet owner, I find I have my pet's medical records more organized than my own until I used DocuVax. DocuVax data is never accessible to anybody but you unless you want to share it privately. And when you do, you can use a proprietary QR code based system. I mush-mouthed tonight to share and keep your data secure at all times. So check out DocuVax. It's very easy. Again, go to your smartphone, DocuVax. Put an end to worrying if you or someone you care about is up to date on a particular vaccine, blood test, or important preventative screening. Take control of your medical file. Sign up at DocuVax on the app or go to docuvax.com. Finally, if you are running a small organization or even a school and you want to get group discounts for having people be able to sign up for DocuVax, you can do that if you mention you heard about it on Equal Footing. The number to call for group discounts is 833-859-1933. That's 833-859-1933.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to. And I've been told.
I'm Dove Tusman. I'm here with Professor David Weddle and Reverend John Haugen. We are talking about the birth of the figure we know as Jesus of Nazareth. Why is it important? Because there's a story of virginal conception, virginal birth, divinity on earth as the Son of God. That concept is very Christian. Very important to Christian theology, and in some way it can be a differentiating factor, if you will, from Judaism. I don't think that we would have much of a problem as Jews thinking of a great teacher, who, by the way, of course, was Jewish, or even a revealer, like a prophetic figure. It's when you transition into this is a deity where you have that theological break. Where does that idea come from? Participate in this conversation on Christology. Yes, there's a word for it. There's an actual study around kind of the humanity/divinity of the Jesus figure. It's called Christology. Participate in this conversation. You can do so live by calling 718-303-9090. That's 718-303-9090. Or you can text or WhatsApp in a comment or question. Please don't call this number, just for texts or WhatsApps, 917-428 917-428-4062. That's 917-428-4062. Professor Weddle, before we went to the break, you mentioned the Gospels as the Christian Gospels as a source. Actually, only two of them, right? Matthew and Luke, where you have mention of Jesus' birth. Now, there are four Gospels, right? There's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And of course, there's the writings of Paul that presumably antedate all of those four. If Jesus' birth was so important to the story, whether it's a virginal birth or not, we'll get to what that really means. Why isn't it mentioned anywhere else? Why are there only two sources, and even within those sources, not much actual language?
Well, these stories are composed later, of course, than the life of Jesus. So they are designed, Matthew's story is designed to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecies in the Torah. And so there are at least 6 references to passages in the prophets that Jesus is said to fulfill. That's why Matthew, by the way, is the first of the 4 Gospels, because it attaches to the end of the Tanakh as the Christians organized it under the name the Old Testament.
Right. It wasn't the first of the Gospels written, but it was like it's the first listed.
Exactly. Because it connects with the prophecy in Malachi, the last of the so-called minor prophets, which talks about a forerunner of the Messiah. So the Gospel of Matthew opens with the story of John the Baptizer. All this is designed to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of Hebrew prophecy, and therefore the inheritor of David's legacy as the King of Israel.
Now, Reverend Haugen, I want to ask a question about Professor Weddle's last point. One of the storylines that makes its way through at least one of those Gospels and then in early Christianity is that Jesus was part of a Davidic royal line. And this takes on increasing importance in the first couple of centuries. But it seems to a layman that runs in opposition to there being a virginal birth, because the royal line would presumably go through his earthly father Joseph, and if Jesus was born from a virgin mother, there was virginal conception, then presumably the royal line would be broken. Is there any kind of explanation to that logical problem when you kind of when you grow up going to Sunday school?
Well, I didn't really encounter the problem until I got to be a docent at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. and there were some artistic representations of the lineage of Jesus. And they led straight to Mary in the art, in the medieval and Renaissance art. But in the scriptures, as you pointed out, they lead straight to Joseph. The explanation that I dug up and doing some research about this was that Mary and Joseph lived in the same community. They were assumed to be distant cousins from one another in the same family, and so that Mary also could claim to be a descendant of David.
Okay. I haven't heard that before. I think that the issue, and I'm going to try to tread lightly here, and I think for some of our pregame discussions, gentlemen, I don't mean to offend anyone. I'm asking the question, channeling what other people might ask, asking the questions as someone who's intellectually curious. What is it, the Shakespearean reference that doth protest too much? It seems like there's quite a bit of cover story going on in the later Gospels around post the uprising, the Jewish uprising against Rome in year 66 to 70, those later Gospels that were written after the war, where one could argue that Jesus, the prophecies of the messianic prophecies are not coming to fruition, and so it has like another storyline starts to get written around the royal line and so forth, and a lot of discussion around like virginal birth and whatnot. Is this not potentially a cover or maybe a defense against rumors at the time about quite the opposite of a virginal conception, or a birth without sin, but an illegitimate kind of birth. I mean, there was even an early, I understand Professor Weddell, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an early church theologian, who's in a battle with a Greek philosopher at the time, who actually asserts that Jesus' father was a Roman soldier, and that the birth was illegitimate. And there are references in Gospels around the son of Mary, whereas normally you'd say son of Joseph if there was a father involved. So is there an argument here that what's happening is that the early Christians are creating a story to kind of address what are pretty persistent rumors that Jesus was an earthly fatherless child, and kind of turning that into, I guess, a grand and good story? Professor Weddell, are you on mute again?
Oh, here we go again.
I like that mute device when I ask a tough question.
Well, the charge that Jesus was essentially a bastard and Mary was raped by a Roman soldier, that started fairly early and continues to be fairly influential in the Islamic understanding of Jesus' birth. Because both Muslims and Jews reject the idea that God could take on human form. And that is what is at the center of these stories which say that Jesus' birth was miraculous. The whole point of saying that Jesus was conceived by the divine Holy Spirit is to separate him from the rest of humanity so that he can become the Savior of the rest of humanity. All of this is, of course, later developed in the New Testament, but it's read back into the birth of Jesus in these stories. Let me pick up this notion of Jesus as the son of David. There is a very strong tradition in Eastern Christianity that Mary also belonged to the line of David, and that she was given, as it were, to Joseph, and his responsibility was to maintain her virginity. When she becomes pregnant, then both she and Joseph are seen to have failed in their responsibilities. And so there has to be an explanation for how she can become pregnant, give birth to Jesus, and still herself remain sinless. And those sort of questions are caught up in later popular Christian literature, especially the literature produced in Syriac in about the 2nd to the 4th centuries.
Before you get to that, because I know that's very interesting stuff. You alluded to it before we were in a conversation before the show, and it deserves its own highlight. But Reverend Haugen, one of the things that I find, I don't know what the right word is, maybe tragic or I would think if I were a Christian, I'd be feeling misunderstood about, is that there's a historicity, proof going on here. Like, was Jesus the result of a virgin birth and so forth. And the idea of the virgin birth story as a fiction meant to cover up like the sordid details of Jesus' illegitimate birth. It almost seems like willing to debate someone on their own terms. It seems to me, that, if you look at the writings of Paul or Gospels of Mark and John or the Gnostic Gospels, all these other Christian sources, they don't really talk about Jesus' birth or even childhood for the most part, or some of them do, but mostly not even the childhood. Isn't there a way to look at this that it doesn't matter, in Christian theology that whether Jesus was born from a virgin birth? I mean, if he was in fact the son of an illegitimate, bastard child, as it were, and from a very humble background, doesn't that in a certain sense make the story more gripping and allow his teachings to be kind of more resonant? I don't understand why it needs to be tied up in this other virgin birth story.
Well, it is what it is in some ways. We're dealing with the writings that have come to us. And those writings certainly were created in a context of debate and of trying to convince the opposition that Jesus was divine as well as fully human. The reason that there are some reasons, as we think about it today, why it's important to think about, for Christians anyway, to think about Jesus as a divine figure as well as human, and that is that if God deigned to become human, became one of us, then it's easier for us to think about how we can relate to Jesus. Jesus experienced, the life and the sorrows and the joys and the problems of being a human being, and then as we go through those kinds of life experiences, in our prayers and in our relationship with Jesus, we have perhaps more confidence that Jesus is compassionate and understands what we're going through because he lived as a fully human being. The incarnation, which is the coming of the divine into the human, is also important because it conveys dignity on humanity, and it helps us. We celebrate the birth of Jesus because it prepares Jesus. It prepares us to think about the rest of Jesus' life as something special, as something that God has done, interrupting the natural processes, as God did so often in the Hebrew Scriptures, interrupting the natural processes, parting the waters, et cetera, and here God interrupts the normal way of conceiving and giving birth as a way to demonstrate that God is involved in human life and has the power to interrupt nature and do things in a divine way rather than a normal human way. So those are some of the reasons why it's important to Christians today, at least, to hang on to those stories, even though in a scientific age like we live in, a lot of us are skeptical, but we try to let the import of the stories, the why of the stories, what it tells us about God and God's relationship to us, we try to let that be what comes to us rather than trying to figure out how scientifically we could analyze what went on.
And you make an important point around the reference to kind of God interrupting the normal evolution of events. And as a couple of listeners have pointed out, this idea of divine intervention and specifically divine conception is rife in the Greco-Roman God pantheon, in the Egyptian pantheon. So this idea of God kind of, if not impregnating, kind of causing a virginal conception in a human being and in a woman is a trope in a certain sense. It goes back thousands of years, which makes sense because it gives you kind of automatic street cred, if you were around the deity, or now it becomes kind of a demigod figure. So there are parallels in other faiths as well. I think in the Jewish faith, we also see intervention, but it tends to be in the intervention where Hashem, causes maybe a woman who should be beyond child birth age becoming pregnant, as opposed to the direct involvement in the conception by a divine figure. We're going to be right back, and Professor Weddle, we are going to get to your Syriac story and a listener question or two when we come back. You're on Equal Footing. We're with Professor David Weddle and Reverend John Haugen. We are talking about the birth of Jesus, alternative received and alternative narratives. We'll be right back.
Equal Footing with Dove Tusman is sponsored by MDCS Dermatology, your experts in skincare. With 2 Manhattan locations and 4 offices in Long Island, including Plainview and Commack, The dermatologists and skincare surgeons at MDCS are proud to be affiliated with the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and New York Presbyterian Hospital. So schedule your next skin exam in one of MDCS's convenient New York area locations. To make an appointment, go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-DERM. That's 212-661-3376. You can even schedule a virtual video visit with MDCS's board-certified dermatologists from the comfort and safety of your own home. So go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-3376. And don't forget to mention Equal Footing for 15% off all cosmetic procedures.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to. I've been told.
We're back on Equal Footing, and we are kicking up dust here. I hope we're not offending anybody. We're having an open discussion with two erudite religious scholars on the birth of Jesus and the, I guess, the divinity of the figure we know as Jesus at birth. Now, got a couple of cool listener questions and comments, but first, with no further preamble, Professor Weddle, tell us about some of these post-gospel writings on the subject.
Yes, well, the gospel accounts are fairly brief, and they leave a lot of unanswered questions, and they are riddled with paradox, as Reverend Haugen pointed out. The notion that Jesus could both be God and man is, in the Christian tradition, a mystery, for there is no rational way to explain that. For example, when Jesus dies, if he is God, then who's minding the store? God has to be more than Jesus, or Jesus is still rotting in the grave. So these stories are designed to say that from the very beginning, Jesus was divine and therefore immortal. But the unanswered question is, how does a human being undergoing normal development deal with the fact that he is divine? This is the kind of question that inquiring minds want to know. And a popular Christian literature was developed in Syriac between the 2nd and 4th centuries. Syriac is a language that is a variation of the language Jesus himself spoke, which was Aramaic. And in one of these documents, which is called the Pre-Gospel of James, there is a whole discussion of Mary and her virginity and her relation to David. When it comes time for the child to be born, Joseph and Mary end up in a cave. This is yet a third location for a Jesus birth story: manger, house, cave. The cave is a very important metaphor, symbol in the Orthodox Eastern Christian tradition. The cave foreshadows the tomb that Jesus will ultimately occupy as part of his redemption of humanity. The child is born with the help of a midwife, according to this story. And when the midwife witnesses the birth, she runs to the front of the cave and yells out, "I have seen a miracle. Something has happened which is against nature. A virgin has given birth." And a passerby by the name of Salome says, "I'm not going to believe that until I actually test the claim." She enters the cave. She puts her finger on the spot, conducts this gynecological exam, which confirms that Mary's hymen is intact and that Jesus has somehow miraculously passed through the birth canal without rupturing the hymen. Therefore, Mary can remain a virgin even after the birth. Now, this story is obviously based on the later story of doubting Thomas. When Jesus appears to his disciples after his resurrection, one of them is absent, Thomas. When the others tell him about Jesus' appearance, he says, "I will not believe until I put my finger on the spot." on the wounds in his hand and side. Jesus accepts that examination, but says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." This story then gets read back into the birth of Jesus to show that from the very beginning, he is possessed with miraculous powers. He is divine.
So, now, sorry, I didn't mean, it's fascinating how these stories, like, you go centuries forward and back, and it's all, of course, now, it's all, to some extent, a big mosh pit, but it makes sense as far as an explanation as to, the first sort of question that you brought up, which is, you've got to establish the relationship between Jesus and God for it all to kind of make sense. I have a more basic kind of, fifth grade question here. Reverend Haugen, when there's reference to siblings, if the story that Professor Weddle holds up and, Mary is a virgin even after the birth, what about Jesus' siblings that are mentioned? Are these other virginal births? Does she remain a virgin throughout this? And is that a problem in the literature?
Well, first I want to respond just briefly and say that the treatment of the Syriac and some of the other non-canonical or outside the Bible stories and reports from the early centuries of Christianity, that's one of the real cutting-edge issues that's being addressed by scholars today. So I just want to make sure that your listeners understand that the average Christian who lives next door to you is not going to know about those stories, and you can fascinate them by repeating what Professor Weddle has told you. But
please keep your thought bubble there. I just want to point out Professor Elaine Pagels was on the show last week. She's a scholar of the Gnostic Gospels and some of these writings, and much of it was discovered through archaeological digs in the 20th century. So this is active, fresh scholarship, as you pointed out. And one place to go for some of that is this book by Professor Elaine Pagels called The Gnostic Gospels. There are many other sources, but as you said, Reverend Doctor, these are relatively fresh discoveries in terms of the context of the spectrum of time we're talking about.
Yeah, they're relatively recent, and they show the diversity of Christian thought in the early centuries, and that diversity, while it has changed content, there's a lot of diversity within Christianity today as well, and how people think about, and how different denominations think about the birth of Jesus and other issues around the Scriptures. But your other question was about how could Jesus have brothers and sisters if Mary remained a virgin. Again, that's not addressed directly in Scripture, as far as I'm aware. But theologians have talked about it, and one of the explanations that has been put forward has been, for centuries, it has been that the brothers and the sisters are really half-brothers or half-sisters or cousins of Jesus, that they are not the biological children of Mary, but of Joseph and of other relatives, let's say. It reminds me of being in Africa, where I was in Tanzania, and one of my hosts was walking with me, and he introduced me to three people who were all his grandfather. And in their conception of family, the wider extended family, many people took on the roles of specific relatives.
Now, Professor Weddle, I don't mean to play too much of a devil's advocate on this one, but there seem to be various references to, for example, James in various texts as Jesus' brother, not in a figurative sense or in a cousin sense, but in a literal sense. Is that not the case?
Yes, that is correct. And in fact, James' authority rests upon his relationship with Jesus. When Jesus died, what happened in the Christian community is what happens in many communities, when the leader is no longer present, then they have to decide who's going to represent us now. And the two possibilities usually are a family member or someone who is recognized as embodying the teachings of the leader. So we have in early Christianity James taking over as head of the church in Jerusalem, and Paul circulating throughout the Mediterranean world, representing Jesus as the cosmic savior, the deliverer of humanity. So these differences had to be settled by the early Christian community. And the appeal of James was that he was a brother of Jesus. Now, perhaps the easiest explanation for this is that we do know from the tradition that Joseph was married before he was engaged to marry. Presumably he was a widower, and Mary was presented to him as one, as the text puts it, virgins of Israel.
All right. So we're going to need to take our last break, but I think that begs a question of if Jesus was a deity, then I would assume that his brothers and sisters or half brothers and sisters would also, in a certain sense, genealogically be deities too. But you mentioned the Apostle Paul, whose writings, I guess, predate the Gospels theoretically, and it's interesting that there's no reference to a virginal birth or virginal conception. No,
that idea doesn't come until the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are circulating.
Right.
Paul would have known nothing about that.
Yeah, or if he did, if the knowledge of the birth story, the birth narrative, probably didn't think it was important enough to mention. We're going to be right back. We're talking to Reverend John Haugen and Professor David Weddle. We're talking about the birth narrative of Jesus. I promise, call-outs and patiently waiting on line one. We're going to get to you right after the break, and we're going to get to some interesting listener comments and questions as well. We'll be right back on Equal Footing. By the way, the music for tonight was, I think, very nicely curated, and it all comes from Peter Gabriel's album Passion, that I think was written for The Last Temptation of Christ, the movie, if I'm not mistaken. But beautiful, beautiful music that attempts to be contemporary in its sound, I should say, appropriate to the period of contemporaneous to the figure we know as Jesus of Nazareth. So pick up that album. It's or download it, I should say. Look, I'm showing my age. Pick up that album. It's a wonderful album. Passion by Peter Gabriel. Okay, we got to do the commercial stuff. Equal Footing is brought to you in part by Mechanical Art Capital. Mechanical Art Capital is a super easy way to get cash for your watches. If you're a watch dealer, many of you in New York area, and are a watch collector, you can unlock the cash value of your collection or inventory through Mechanical Art Capital's easy buyback contracts. You can literally get cash overnight. And you can do so just by downloading the Mechanical Art Capital app from the App Store on your phone. Just go to Mechanical Art Capital, 3 words, and you can get your watches, your inventory of watches or your watch collection appraised. That's free of charge, which you can use for insurance purposes or whatever. And then the app will also show you how to raise cash quickly from those watches you had appraised. You don't have to sell them, just getting financing against them, especially relevant this holiday period where people often need liquidity. You can also call Mechanical Art Capital about their buyback program for your watch collection or your watch inventory by calling 833-209-0972. Again, that's Mechanical Art Capital, 833-209-0972.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on to. I've been told.
You're back on Equal Footing. We are in a show on Christology, study of the being, the humanity, the divinity, the person of Jesus, and particularly his birth. I have had some listeners write notes about what the veracity of the being itself. Did the person named Jesus exist? Question for another show. I'm going to just cut it off a little bit at the pass. Consensus is that yes, a figure named Jesus did exist, a Jesus of Nazareth. There were other Jesuses at the time, for different places, and this Jesus of Nazareth, whether all the teachings and stories came from that one person, they've over the centuries been attributed to that person. It almost, I would argue, doesn't matter so much in a certain sense, but the theology, the faith, and the philosophy matters. Okay. Let's take a caller if he's still waiting or she on line 1. Let's see if we can get caller on line 1. Sorry, are you there?
I'm here.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Happy
How are
Hanukkah.
You?
Good.
Happy Hanukkah. How are you, Dove?
I'm good. Stan.
Bingo.
I'm bracing myself.
You better tie yourself down to the ground on this one, Dove. Dove, there is more sanctity, more truth, more absolute belief that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, that Jesus Christ is a God or will ever come back. He has not shown his face. He's never shown his face. He's never come back. In incidents of great tribulation in this world, he's never been. Where is he? He's never. Was he in Florida vacationing? No. The God situation does not exist. It never did. It is man's own insecurity. That is not just that, but Hanukkah too, with the candles, where we worship and have Hanukkah and light 8 candles. On what? On a war of Maccabees that died on a mountain and in the end killed themselves? We celebrate that. We have parties. We give gifts for that. Do you see the parallel and the madness of religion in this situation, of Christianity and Judaism? I'm a Jew, but I stopped fairy tales a long time ago. And I have nothing against the Reverend and these gentlemen, but let's get real and start getting real with ourselves here, please. I mean, the world's crazy, there's no doubt, but come on.
Stan, let me ask you a question. I hear where you're coming from, and I don't disagree with the good amount of what you said. If the kind of the core of tonight's program around the birth narrative of Jesus
he existed, he was born.
Hang on a second.
Yes, that's as far as it goes.
I have a question for you. It's a legit question. It's not a setup. It's a legit question. I think that where we're going with the program tonight is kind of at this question's been wrestled with over time of do we have to situate Jesus as being divine? I'm not saying we as Jews, but is that essential to Christian belief?
Isn't that question have already been answered, Dove? I mean, you ask a question,
but here's my question. You haven't heard my question.
To.
No, I haven't.
Right, go ahead.
My question
I'm
is,
sorry.
It's okay. My question is, if this figure Jesus was not divine, if he was a teacher who had wise things to say, I think we can all acknowledge that. Does that, and you don't expect him to come back there, therefore? I mean, these gospels that were referred to just now by Reverend Haugen and that were quoted by Professor Weddle to some degree, that sit outside of the canon, acknowledge that to some degree. Jesus was a teacher and not, you don't have to believe it's divine. If that's the case, doesn't that give you kind of, in a certain sense, maybe newfound respect for Jesus? If there's no expectation that
it probably would if the majority of the Christian world didn't believe he was a God. It would have respectability if that was the case. But that's not the case, Dove. You say you wanted to listen to the history of Christianity, and they believe it to this moment. Come on. The evidence is right in front of you. Human history has proven, without doubt, no one has come back. He has never come back, and he never will. But
sorry, Stan. I think you got cut off a little bit earlier. We were trying to cut you off, but not quite before you finished the sentence. The reason we're cutting off is not because I didn't respect the point of view, but because I want to get some others questions. But I do want to pivot to you, Reverend Haugen, because what happens, I'm sure that Stan's position is one that you've heard before, even in congregations. Can someone reconcile a belief that Jesus was in no way divine in the way that in the classic definition here, but as a teacher, a revealer of truth, and still be kind of fully Christian, if you will?
Well, there are certainly big tent Christians who would welcome. Well, let me say this: at least there is respect among many Christians for those who hold the views that were just expressed. And much of Islam, for example, honors Jesus as a prophet, as a teacher. And I think the challenge for your caller is to see if he might come to a greater respect for those who have experiences and faith that differ from his own.
And I think, Reverend, that a lot of Jewish listeners, myself as a participant here, as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, would say that to some degree the Holocaust introduces a similar existential question and doubt around our faith. It's like, okay, if God exists, then where was God at that moment? Where was the intervention when most needed? So that question, what is that called, Professor? What is that, theodicy?
Trying to resolve the problem of evil.
Right. We addressed that a little bit last week. Let's get another listener question here out, which I think is interesting. One listener wants to point out that the scientific explanation for virgin birth has not been mentioned here. It is called, I hope I can pronounce this correctly, parthenogenesis. It's common in many animals, birds, fish, reptiles, etc. This is a birth without conception from with single gender conception. It's spontaneous events, and it can also occur in humans, but it usually results in tumors like an ovarian teratoma or hydatidform mole. I'm sure I butchered those names. So virgin birth actually does exist in science, I guess somewhat recently understood. Reverend Haugen, does that matter? Does that matter to this analysis?
You're out of my field of expertise.
Well, I would like to say no, not at all.
Say it again, Professor.
No. Go ahead, Professor.
Examples of parthenogenesis in nature are simply irrelevant to the gospel stories about Jesus' birth. The point is, he is conceived by God. Right. That's the whole point of the stories. So, you could have all kinds of examples in nature of self-replication, but this is not miraculous. It's quite ordinary, as a matter of fact. What's important about this? Right. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. So we have time for one more question here before we break. It's literally a 30-second response, but I wanted to get to this because I think it encapsulates, in a certain sense, the reason we even came on the air tonight with this question. This listener asks, what are the practical implications here? Whether he was divine or not, whether he came from virginal birth or not, does it really matter? Someone tell me why. Reverend Haugen, can you answer this listener before we finish?
I think it matters. It doesn't matter to me personally as a Christian whether the birth narratives are historically, scientifically true or a literary fiction that tells me something about God and how I might relate to the mysteries that are holy and sacred in this world and that I experience. So maybe that's. I know we're running out of time, so that I think I'll just stop there.
I think that's a nice way to end. Thank you both for talking about here the birth of Jesus. Again, Merry Christmas to you. Happy Hanukkah to so many of our listeners. Professor David Weddle, Reverend John Haugen, thanks for joining us tonight. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.